In the last video, we discussed about units. In this video, we are going to discuss about dimension and dimensional formula of physical quantities. What is dimension or dimensional formula? Let's define this. Expressing any physical quantity, any PQ means physical quantity, in terms of powers of fundamental quantities. In terms of powers of fundamental quantities. FQ means fundamental quantities. Remember that. What is dimensional formula? Expressing any physical quantity in terms of powers of fundamental quantities. For example, if I take a random physical quantity, suppose x, if I can express this x in terms of powers of fundamental quantities. What are fundamental quantities? We know these three are enough. We mostly use these three. In terms of powers of this, for suppose L power A, M power B, P power C. If I can express any random physical quantity x like this in terms of powers of these fundamental quantities, that is known as dimensional formula. If you understand this, it's fine. Otherwise, we will solve few examples on this, then you will get to know it. Before that, we must know the difference between what is unit and dimension. Let's start with fundamental quantities, their units, dimension, and finally dimensional formula. Start with length. Units of length are centimeter, millimeter, meter, and so many, kilometer, like this. I don't want to write all these units. These are different dimensions of length, different ways of expressing length. Instead of expressing in different ways, why can't I express all these terms a single letter, that is L in between two square brackets? This is what dimension means. What is dimension? Expressing all the different ways of measuring it with a single letter is known as a dimension of length or dimension of any quantity. Understand? We'll discuss dimensional formula later. Next, fundamental quantity, mass. Mass also have different units like kilogram, gram, milligram, like this. If I want to express all these units with a single letter, that is dimension. Dimension of mass is in between square brackets. After this, time. Time also has different units like second, minute, hour, day, like this. But if I want to express all these units with a single letter, that is dimension, right? Dimension of time is capital T in between the square brackets. After that, temperature. Temperature also has different units like degrees centigrade, degrees Fahrenheit, Kelvin. Dimensional representation is capital K in between square brackets. Current. Next, electric current. Units are amperes. Dimensional representation is capital A in between the square brackets. Next, light intensity. Units of light intensity is candela, like so many other, but dimensional representation is CD in between square brackets. Last one, amount of substance. Units are mole. Dimensional representation is this. Out of these 7 fundamental quantities and their dimensions, we mostly use 4 or 5. 3 are important. We mostly use these 3. Sometimes we use these 2 also, mostly. Now come to dimensional formula. By the definition, dimensional formula means expressing any physical quantity in terms of fundamental quantities, right? Length is a physical quantity. I want to express length in terms of remaining physical quantities. For example, what's the power of L here? 1, right? So L power 1. Length doesn't depend on mass. So M power 0. Because why this 0, M power 0? Because length doesn't depend on mass. Similarly, length doesn't depend on time also. Length doesn't depend on temperature also, right? But I conclude like, I end up like this. I'll just write those three quantities only. Next, mass. Mass doesn't depend on length, so L power 0. Mass depends on M, right? So M power 1, P power 0. This is the dimensional formula of length, dimensional formula of mass. Except for M, remaining two quantities are zeros. Here, except for L, remaining two quantities are zeros. For time, length is 0, mass is 0. For temperature, length is 0, mass is 0, time is 0, but K is 1. This is dimensional formula of temperature. For current, electric current, length is 0, mass is 0, T is 0, K is 0, K is 1. Or you can represent dimension of current with capital A or capital I also. Sometimes we can use I also. Instead of A, you can write I also. I power 1. Similarly, for these two quantities also, you can write. This is what dimensional formula is.